All right. Good evening and welcome everyone to the virtual Marlene Meyerson JCC Manhattan. My name is Jason Blitman and I'm the program director for the Lambert Center for Arts and Ideas here at the JCC. It is my pleasure to welcome you to our final event of the summer, our great big community book club featuring Kristin Harmel and her book, The Forest of Vanishing Stars. A big thank you to our friends at Shakespeare & Co. for partnering with us on this event. We hope you were able to get your awesome books from them. Conversations are made possible by the generous support of the one and only Zabars and Zabars.com, and virtual programming for the Lambert Center is supported by the Lori M. Tisch Illumination Fund. Keep a lookout for announcements about our exciting fall programming that will be announced via email and on our website in the coming weeks. Tonight is a bit of an experiment, and the hope is that most of you have read the book tonight, and if you didn't have a chance to fill out the Google form that we'd sent around, that's totally fine. If you still have questions, you'll be able to ask them later on in the program. Feel free to use the chat function to ask some questions, or as we're having the conversation, ask questions that are pertinent, or we'll also open up to a proper Q&A at the end. We might have time for you to unmute and ask your questions. We ask that if you do that, to please just be expeditious with your asking so that we can make sure to have time for other folks to ask questions as well. And if you have a follow-up question, please ask that in the chat. And if we get to that, we will. And a final reminder that we will have some spoilers for the book tonight. So if you haven't read it, we'll do our best to make a little announcement that we'll talk about spoilers beforehand, so that if you want to leave the Zoom room and then watch the rest of the program later, we're happy to give you the heads up. Now it is my absolute pleasure to introduce Kristin Harmel. Kristin is the New York Times bestselling author of a dozen novels, including The Book of Lost Names, The Winemaker's Wife, The Room on Rue Amélie, and The Sweetness of Forgetting. She's also the co-founder and co-host of the popular web series Friends and Fiction, and she lives in Orlando, Florida. Hello, Kristin Harmel.
Hello, Jason. Thank you so much for having me.
Thank you so much for being here. It's so exciting. We have so many folks here with us. It looks like we have about 85 people
That's
here.
awesome.
Welcome, all of you.
Yeah,
I hope this is like a nice casual environment. We can't be together in person to have a big book club, so we could be casual virtually. I was telling Kristin I'm wearing short sleeves, very summer cash tonight.
and I in turn admitted to wearing pajama bottoms, so same.
So we're all cozy together. It's totally great. First, I just have to say congratulations on the ridiculous success on your last book, The Book of Lost Names. I have to tell you, I've been seeing it everywhere I go. I see it in the grocery store, I see it in Target, I see it in Costco, and finally I was like, I have to buy it. So I bought it at Costco, I read it. It's delicious. For any of you who haven't read it, I highly recommend picking up The Book of Lost Names.
Thank you.
And then email me and we could talk about it because we can't talk about it tonight because there are so many spoilers. And
I didn't have to have me back again. Obviously.
Yes, we'll have to have you back. And because people weren't prepared, we can't spoil this book.
No.
So I want to do a little bit of a group warm up so that we can just get a sense of how many folks with us have actually read the book. So our friend Sam is going to put up a little a poll on the screen that'll just say whether or not you've read the book. And if you can let us know, just click it. Yes. Okay. Oh, and the numbers are coming up. They're going. Numbers are bopping. All right. A pretty solid amount of people so far. Oh, we have a few virtual hand raising.
Okay.
Great. So it looks like roughly 75% of the people here tonight or so.
Great. Okay.
Amazing. All right, we'll keep that up for a couple more seconds if people care to respond. That would be, there are other folks that have replied saying they've read other books of yours.
Kathy. That's very nice. Thank you.
Oh, we're truly at 75%. This is great to know.
Yeah, okay.
All right, we're gonna end the poll. And now a follow-up to see, again, a group warm-up. What other books of Kristin's have you read? A poll is gonna come up. You could choose a book. Let's say your latest book, or the latest book of Kristin's that you read. There's a list that'll pop up. No.
I've read them all. Does that help? Can I vote? Am I allowed to vote?
Okay,
there it is.
There it is.
Wow,
Oh,
Okay. Okay.
oh, wow.
Oh, this is interesting. I love this. Like the little like data crunching side of my brain is like, ooh, interesting.
Oh, wow. So lots of folks here have read the Book of Last Names.
Okay. Okay.
Amazing. So exciting.
All right. I love that.
Terrific. Okay, see, I feel like we're all in the room together. We'll leave that poll up for a little while in case people have other things they want to add. Um, and some of you have also perhaps gotten some swag from Shakespeare and Co. Did anyone get any of the Forest of Vanishing Stars swag that you can show off to us tonight? Do you have it with you? Anyone? No? Oh, Susie, I saw raise her hand, but she doesn't have it with her. I saw this, and then I saw a sad, oh no, I don't have it with me. Okay, well, I hope that you're enjoying your swag and you think of World War II every time you carry something in your swag bag that you have.
That's awesome.
Okay, Kristin, my first big question that I know people are burning to ask you, that I'm gonna read a little bit in your author's note of Book of Lost Names to help us shape this question.
Okay.
How did you get into World War II stories? And let me embellish by asking you this.
Okay.
So this is from the author's note. I promise I'm not giving anything away from Book of Lost Names. So this is her fifth book about World War II, and one of her favorite things about writing about the war is that she's able to dig deep into subjects many of us may not be familiar with. In her 2012 novel, The Sweetness of Forgetting, for example, part of the story revolves around Muslims helping to save Jews in Paris after the German invasion, something many readers had never heard about. When We Meet Again, her novel published in 2015, talks about more than 400,000 German POWs in the United States in the 1940s, a piece of our history that slipped away with the passage of time. And in 2019, The Winemaker's Wife wrote about the resistance that occurred beneath the earth and among the twisted vines of picturesque Champagne region. So all of these really incredible things I had never known about the forest, and I also had never known about the forgers in Book of Lost Names. So can you please share, how did you get into the world of World War II?
Yeah, thank you. Such a great question and excellent framing. No one has ever framed that question quite so well. I'm extremely impressed already. Okay. So I initially came to World War II the way that probably a lot of people come to World War II when I was a kid through the Diary of Anne Frank. So that was the book. And I know you've heard me say this before, Jason, because I know you've watched interviews with me. But Anne Frank was truly, the Diary of Anne Frank was really the book that changed the course of my life. Because it was the book that taught me that books could actually change the world. So prior to reading that book, I thought that books were for entertainment. Like I grew up on Nancy Drew and the Hardy Boys and the Bobbsey Twins and all these books I pulled down from my grandparents' attic. And I thought all those books were just about interesting stuff, about fun, about escape. And I wanted to be a person who changed the world. And I thought I would love to write books one day, but I should do something more important with my life. And then I read The Diary of Anne Frank and I thought, oh my gosh, I can do both. I can do this thing I'm so passionate about, which is, sharing stories. But if I do it right, I can be someone who changes the world. And in fact, I was so drawn to it even back then that the first short story I ever wrote and submitted anywhere was about a girl in a concentration camp when I was in seventh grade. So like this is something I've been writing about since I was 12 or maybe early 13. I think probably 12 though. But then I started off writing novels and I didn't start writing World War II because I wrote my first novel when I was 23. And I didn't feel like I had the depth as a person yet to tackle something like that. And so it was part lack of faith and also I think like faith in myself and just part feeling like it wouldn't be a responsible thing to do until I've grown up enough to kind of wrap my head around it. And I'm not sure if that was right or not, but that's how I felt at the time. So I started off writing chick lit, like, books that were similar to like Bridget Jones's Diary or The Devil Wears Prada or, that kind of thing. Cause that was what was in when I was 23. It was the mid 2000s, it was all about like Sex and the City and Bridget Jones, The Devil Wears Prada, all that. So it made sense at the time. But the more I wrote in that genre, the more I was like, this isn't where I'm supposed to be. I loved it, but I felt called to do something else. And then I was writing for People magazine at the time, and I had the opportunity to interview this incredible man who was a Holocaust survivor. He had been imprisoned in concentration camps from the age of 13 to the age of 18. And in the conversation, one of the conversations we had, he was talking about how in order to survive in the concentration camps, he had to learn to turn his emotions off. And when the war ended, he had no idea how to turn them back on again because he turned them off. He had to turn them off
Mm.
at such a formative age that, you know, when he was 18 and the war was over and, you know, when he was no longer in these concentration camps, something inside him had been forever altered. And that was such a profound and moving thing to me because I had thought before that so much about the tangible things people lose. But that was something that I had never really considered. I mean, of course, I understood that a time period like that would forever shape the course of your life. I don't think I understood that something could take your feelings away and how completely that would shape everything that came after. And that thought just got stuck in my head and got stuck in my heart. And the more I thought about it, the more I thought this is something I have to write about. And
Mm.
that became the core of one of the main characters of The Sweetness of Forgetting, which was my first World War II novel. And once I wrote that novel, I just realized I had found exactly where I was meant to be. Like, not only did it feel like such a fit, and I felt like I was doing what I was just meant to, like, it just felt so right. Um, but I've also found that every story leads me to the next story because there are so many fascinating things that I come across in my research that don't fit in the first book, but that feels so big and so important and so relevant today that I need to put them somewhere, and they wind up being the next book. So that was my very long answer to your very short
Mm.
question. Sorry.
No, I think that's so great. And a lot of people, their input had been wondering about how you got into
Yeah.
writing World War
Yeah.
II novels. Did you even realize that you have three tiny little breadcrumbs? The word vanishing exists three times in the book?
Stop. No, I did not. I really did not.
Well, because I read it second, it
That's
really, I was able to see it in
amazing.
a way. In fact, on the very first page, one, two, three, the third line says the word vanished in it. And I was like, ooh, foreshadowing, vanishing stars.
Does. Oh my God, that was completely unintentional. That's so interesting. Now you make me want to like grab a copy of it and look for myself. That's amazing. I had no idea. Thank you for telling me about my books.
Yes, I know. So do you, as a person who writes historical fiction
Yeah.
and specifically World War II, do you feel, I mean, you just said you want to do something important, right? You want to tell an important story. Do
Yes.
you feel the burden of social responsibility of sharing this story and making sure that people are seeing things from that there's an accessible way of hearing this story?
Yes, I do. That is a great question. And I think it's something that I have felt more and more with each passing book. And I think part of that has just been that I'm growing up, if that makes sense,
Mm.
with each book, like growing. You know, I just think in general, as you get older and as you experience more things in life, like the bigger picture becomes clearer, if that makes sense. So I think when I was writing The Sweetness of Forgetting, which was right around the time I was 30, I understood that I was doing something that had the power to make a difference by highlighting something we should know about,
Mm.
and by reminding us of a time period that some people would prefer to forget, or some people would not acknowledge, you know, the things that took place. And I do think it's important to keep sharing these stories for that reason. But I don't think I've really I don't with each subsequent book, I would say I've grasped the enormity of the responsibility more. And I think part of that has come from um, speaking to survivors again and again, who have read the books, who write to me because they've read something, or the children of survivors in a lot of cases too, who are impacted by something I've said, and who in their messages to me say things like that. And so that's meaningful to me. But I think also the older I get, the more I realize how connected the past is to the present, and how relevant this thing that happened 75 or 80 years ago is to the world we live in today. I think I realized that there are so many lessons that it seems like we should have learned 80 years ago, that we haven't. And I think I think I don't always do it perfectly, just like I don't do anything in life perfectly. But I think that my heart is very much in the right place with wanting to keep these stories alive and wanting to share these stories of people finding light in the darkness and people fighting against injustice and um, people honoring where they came from in the way that they choose where they're going, if that makes sense. So it does feel really important to me, and it's something I think about a lot more than I used to as I go forward and as I craft future books, if that makes sense.
And as I imagine, you are researching these books and writing things that feel too present.
Yeah, it's incredible how present they still feel.
Yeah.
Uh, but I think the mere fact that they still feel so present means that we have to keep talking about them. We have to keep sharing the stories.
Right.
And something that's kind of on my bucket list for the next few years, when I finally have a chance to kind of take a breath between books, because I've been writing a book a year, and I'm finally taking a little bit of a breath. My next book's not going to be out next summer; it's going to be out in March of 23.
Oh,
But
we're done. This is over.
I
Let's go out of the room.
but what I was going to say is one of the things I want to do when I have a little bit more breathing room like that, I would really, really like to write World War II for middle grade readers, because
Oh
I
wow.
think I think that's the age that I was when middle grade's about age 8 through 12 or so, and
Mhm.
that's the age I was when I realized how important this piece of our past was. Um, and I want to make sure that I'm continuing to share that with a generation that's young enough um, to fall in love with the idea of doing something about it and of carrying the memories forward and of doing something impactful for the future influenced by the past. Does that make sense?
It makes so much sense and it's incredible. I that work for young people is just so important, and
I
I
think so
admire that
too.
so much, and I think that that's so terrific. So many folks have jumped in saying they love that you want to write for middle grades. Yes, with many exclamation
Yay.
points. Education
Good.
is important for young adults and young readers. There was a question that was great, that relates to how you choose the specific nuggets of World War II history to share. So you've mentioned you might find a nugget of something along your research for a different book. How does that speak to you?
That's a great question. I think it varies from book to book and idea to idea. But I think a big part of it for me is, first of all, coming across something that stops me in my tracks and makes me think, oh my gosh, I haven't heard that before. Like, and that's so interesting and so surprising. Or I have heard that before, but I've only heard the tiniest bit about it and I want to know more. So, like, the first thing is really just a personal thing that, like, it's fascinating to me, and I feel like if it captures my interest that much, maybe there's something there. Do you know what I mean? And then I think the other part of it is, I think, and it might even be more of a subconscious thing, but I think I really seek out stories that kind of have the recurring theme of finding light in the darkness. And that's something I don't think I was consciously doing until a couple of years ago. I think I didn't understand that I kept having that theme in my novels, but now I look back and I feel like that thread runs through all of it. This idea of, like, ordinary people finding a way to be extraordinary in the midst of, like, just these extremely difficult dark times. And I feel like that's at the heart of all of these books. And so I think when I think that's just what I keep writing circles around myself, and that's the story I'm drawn to. And so I think that's another thing for me when I come across ideas that seem interesting. I think subconsciously I'm asking myself, can I tell that story through this framework? Does that make sense?
Sure. Yeah, no, that's a, a very interesting way of tapping into it. Uh,
Yeah.
Along the same lines, to talk a little bit about your process, so as you just said, you've been coming out with a book a year, which is astounding. Congratulations. When I looked to see what the pub dates were, I was like, wait a minute, how does she do that? That's not, and you have a small child, and I don't understand.
Yes.
Um, but I imagine there is an emotional burden but I imagine there's an emotional burden regardless of what you're writing. But
Yeah.
this the content is so heavy.
Yeah.
But your books are also so tremendously meticulously researched, and I'm sure people tell you that all the time. I mean, it's like
Thank you.
stupid how much we feel like we're learning as we're reading a
Oh,
Kristin
thank
Harmel book.
you.
But can you talk a little bit about what your process is like? You spill your guts out on and then you do it again for another book soon after. Tell us,
Well,
how do you do it?
that's so sweet of you to say. I think part of it is having a background in journalism. So
Mm,
I came up through the ranks of journalism for a long time, and I think that taught me a lot about research and about interviewing people and about, trying to get all the facts right. And I think it's been a work in progress for me. I think if you go back to The Sweetness of Forgetting, which was my first World War II novel, I did a lot. I mean, the research is there. I did all the research, but I think it shows up less on the page because I was focusing on the story more. And I think as I've grown as a writer, and particularly as a World War II writer over the last decade, I have found more and more ways to work that research into the novel in a way that serves the story, if that makes sense. But in general, my process is to begin with a few months of just research. So, once I have an idea for a book, I do a lot of reading. First of all, just to make sure, A, that there's enough that I can find that I feel comfortable setting a book in whatever world it is that I'm planning to write about. So, for example, with the Book of Lost Names, which you mentioned, that's about forgery. And that was difficult because there's not a ton written about document forgery because it was such a secret thing. And like, everyone was conditioned to be quiet about it. And so it wasn't something that was heavily talked about after the war. So in order to know that I could do that book, I needed to find that there was enough to write about. So that's kind of the first step. Then once you find that there is indeed enough research material there to be a jumping off point, I just do months of reading. And as I'm doing that reading, the story's taking place or taking shape in my head, because I'm slowly thinking like, okay, this real historic thing happened, so my character could do this, and like they have to encounter this moment in time to get to this moment in time, and ooh, these are some of the things that could happen in between. Like it's just everything I read, it's kind of going into the big stew of what will become the novel.
mhm,
And so by the time I actually sit down to outline the book, and I'm a big outliner, but by the time I sit down to outline, I have kind of all the broad historical framework, and probably 75% of the story has already kind of taken shape in my head. And then I put it down on paper, and that's kind of where I work out the rest of the beats, who the characters are, exactly what's going to happen, exactly where these moments in time are going to connect. And that's also the point in time that I usually begin reaching out to secondhand or like firsthand sources. So it begins with just reading, but then I want to interview people if I can, or I want to talk to people who are experts in whatever I'm talking about. So, for example, for the Forest of Vanishing Stars, one of the people I talked to was a forest expert, an expert on the forest I was writing about, because that was something I really needed to get a handle on. But I didn't start talking to him until I was late in the outline process, early in the writing process. So, like, until I kind of knew which blanks I needed filled in.
mm.
And then I continue to do research through the first draft. And then once I've turned in the first draft, my editor usually has a lot of questions that result in additional research in the second draft. And then I turn that draft in, and then the copy editor usually has 53 million additional questions that I have to track down the answers to. And all of that usually winds up happening in November and December. So my head is usually like exploding on a daily basis
Mhm.
through the holidays, which is always lovely. So
And then you
that's my
hibernate for a couple of
process.
weeks, and then you do it all again for
I
your.
do it all again because I'm obviously a crazy person. Exactly.
So tell us a little bit about the nugget that got you to the Forest of Vanishing Stars.
So that is a great question. And this is the one book that I can't describe a very clear genesis for.
Mm,
So most of my other books, I can tell you exactly where the idea came from. So, for instance, the Book of Lost Names, that was because in my two previous novels, which involved the French Resistance, I had forged documents playing a role. So people would move from one point to the next using forged documents. And I started thinking to myself, well, who are these people forging these documents? I don't, are their stories interesting? How do you get into forgery? All of those things, which kind of became the core questions that led me on, on the road to that book. But for the Forest of Vanishing Stars, I knew I wanted to venture outside of France, because I had written several books set in World War II France, which wasn't, I, I, I think France is a very appealing place to write about because, we all have kind of, uh, most people I think have very warm feelings toward Paris just in general. It's just a romantic and, a wonderful place with wine and food and beautiful architecture and all of that. But I used to live in Paris for a little while, and my part of my dad's side of the family is French. So I think those were the things that drew me initially to writing about Paris. But I had kind of gotten comfortable writing about Paris, and I wanted to push myself. I wanted to do something that wasn't Paris, and I wanted to do something that was outside my comfort zone. Um, I had heard about
Belarusian forest.
yeah, like talk about going outside your comfort zone, right? And I'm not like a super like outdoorsy person. I mean, I love the outdoors. I love going to the beach. I love going to Disney World, out walking around outdoors. But like, that's not the same thing as surviving in the wilderness. I'm not a very survivally person. So, that was very much a challenge for me because it wasn't stuff I knew. You know what I mean? It was not a world I was comfortable with. But I had known a little bit before about the story of refugees surviving in the forests of Eastern Europe because I had seen the movie Defiance, all the way back in, it came out at the very end of 2008. I probably saw it in early 2009. And it's a great movie. If you haven't seen it, it's based on the true story of the Bielski Otriad, which was the most well-known of the refugee groups in this particular area of Eastern Europe. It was a group that grew to 1,200 people by the end of the war. It was led by four brothers with the last name Bielski. It was a fairly, well-known group after the war. So I had always found that story really interesting, but it had retreated all the way to the back of my head. It wasn't anything that I had ever planned to write about. And this idea for this book just kind of came out of nowhere. I really started thinking like, okay, I need to find another light in the darkness kind of story. I want to tell a story of strength. I want to tell a story of Jewish refugees essentially saving themselves, which I think is a really important story to tell. And this just felt like the story. And if you've read the book and if you've read the author's note, you know that it was midway through researching this or midway through writing this story that my brother shared our ancestry.com family tree with me. And it turned out I had never known that my dad's side of the family, which is my Jewish side of the family, had actually come from an area of Poland not that far away from from the area I was writing about. And that was a revelation to me. I had no idea that our family had even come from Poland. Um, During the period of time that I would have been talking to my dad about those things, we weren't that close. He didn't know that much about his family background. Like a lot of this stuff had just kind of gotten lost with time. But to go back through those records and realize that I had a family connection to that region, and that in fact, my great great grandmother, who came to the United States right before the turn of the last century, so about 50 years before the start of World War II, she actually made a trip back to Europe in, I think it was 1933. You can tell from there are records of her boarding a ship called the SS Ile-de-France and sailing over. She was 69 years old, and she went over, and I assume she must have gone over to visit family and friends because, in 1933, if you were 69, you probably didn't just get on a pleasure cruise to Europe. It wasn't like an easy crossing at that time. And, so it must have been to go visit family essentially for the last time, right? And it felt like a very profound thing to me to realize, that she had been there. She had been in Poland 6 years before World War II began. And she died in 1941. And I have to think she died fully aware of what was happening, to these loved ones that she'd left behind. And so, I've said this before in other talks, but one of the things I think is really interesting about discovering that is that one of the questions at the core of this novel, I think, is a question of identity. So Yona, the main character, is really struggling with this idea of, well, who am I? I was born to these German parents. I've been told that they're bad people. I was raised by a woman who comes from this long tradition of Jewish women. I've now joined forces with this group of Jewish refugees. Later she winds up working with these Catholic nuns. Like she kind of goes through all these versions of her. And so like, who is she? Like that's kind of what she's questioning the whole novel. Does she is she guilty for the things that her father did, or things that she was connected to through her blood but that she didn't do herself? And like, how much of your story is in your blood? How much of who you are meant to be is pre-written, right? And I think that my answer when I began writing this book might have been different than it was by the time I finished writing it. And part of that was the realization that I was drawn, for reasons I can't explain, to writing a story that had some connection to my own blood, and that I didn't know that. And so it has made me think that maybe our stories are a little bit, the stories of our past, even the ones we don't know, are a little bit of who we become, even if we don't understand that's why we're on that path. Does that make sense?
It does. I mean, and because we're about halfway through, I'm going to say, spoiler alert, anyone who wants to jump off, now is the time. If you haven't read the book, read the book and read the author's note. Vamping, get off your Zoom if you don't want any spoilers. Okay, spoilers. Did you know that Yona was half Jewish as you were going into writing this?
I didn't in the very first half of the outline, but by the time I finished the outline, I did.
Yeah.
I knew that she had to be. And it's interesting because I can't remember how much of this I've put in this book, probably not a lot. Um, I think one of the reasons that I keep writing about people who have a relation, like I keep writing about characters who have questions about their religious identity. And I think part of that is very personal because I didn't know that half of my family was Jewish until I was about 20. And it wasn't, yeah, and it wasn't that anyone had deliberately not talked about it. It was because my dad's dad was agnostic, and so my dad wasn't really raised with religion, although I've asked him about it. I asked him about it right before I began um, going on tour for this book. I said, do you remember any part of your upbringing where your dad talked about this or your mom talked about this, because they both came from Jewish backgrounds? And he said, well, yeah, I went to Hebrew school for a couple of years. And I was like, what? And he said, yeah, he said my dad didn't believe in religion, but he believed that what I had come from was something that I should know and that I should carry forward. And so he wanted him to know the cultural aspect, even if he didn't believe in the religious aspect. So my dad did grow up with the cultural knowledge of where he had come from, but because he didn't have that religious attachment, he didn't carry that forward into his marriage to my mom, who's Catholic. And so that was just kind of lost. And it was just a piece, it wasn't an important piece of my dad's identity, so it wasn't something that there was never a moment where it became part of a conversation we had, because that had kind of been lost in his generation, if that makes sense.
Sure.
And so like when I was 20 and I was living in New York and for the first time, and I met my dad's cousin, who I've since become very close with. And the first time I went to her apartment, she had this whole bookshelf of books about like Jewish studies, right? And I was like, that's interesting. How come you have all these books? And she was like, because we're Jewish. And I was like, huh? Who's Jewish? And she was like,
That's how you found
you're
out?
Jewish? And I
Wow.
was like, what? So it was this whole, so that was, that was when I was about 20. I'm 42 now. So that was about half a lifetime ago. And I think so much of my journey as a person and as a writer since then has been shaped by that whole question of who am I, and how does that change who I am, and how does that change what I owe to the world, and how does that change who I need to be in this world. And the answer, I think, is I'm exactly the same person I was before. And that's such an interesting thing for me to get into in my writing. And so to me, that was something I really wanted to see Yona explore too. Um, and I don't know. That was just such an interesting part of the identity exploration for me. That idea of what does our past make us, and what does our religion make us, and what does the religion that runs through our blood make us, if it's not necessarily the religion we were raised with.
Sure.
But I it was very important to me by the end of the book to make her Jewish because um, one of the pieces of, and I'm sorry, I'm giving a really long answer. I'm just trying to kind of get like tell you all the like personal stuff about like why this felt so important to me. But one of the reasons I really wanted to write about these Jewish refugees is because in real life they did save themselves. Yes, they had help from, Catholic farmers on the edges of the forest who were sympathetic, or, people like that, but they really did save themselves. And I would have been doing a disservice to the story if I had somebody who was not Jewish come in and say, here I am to save the day. Like I never would have written that, and it would have been an enormous disservice to the real life story. And so I think it had to unfold the way it did. And I'm proud that it unfolded the way it did. I hope that makes sense.
It does. No, I love that.
Okay.
Marlene said it was Beshert, and Susan said yes, it was. And it's so funny. The amount of Beshert or things that happen in the book, I know that in other people have called it magical realism.
Yeah.
It's, I would say it's not magical. I think it's these weird intergalactic things happening in real life. I mean, I shared with you earlier, I met my husband. I was seated next to him on a plane. We happened to be on our birthright trip, and that was very much Beshert. And so things like that have happened. To tell you a quick story, and then I want to talk a little bit about this idea in the book. I was on a Zoom call with some friends last night. These friends, I said, I can't believe that I'm chatting with you tonight prior to having this conversation about this book tomorrow, because these friends, my husband and I were on vacation in the suburbs of Spain. We were trying to get back to Barcelona. We didn't know where we were going. And we ended up having this conversation with this American family on the train platform. We've been friends ever since. So I was like, how funny, because there are these elements of life happening in such a funny way. It gets crazier.
Yeah.
So then they were like, this is so cool. What is the book about? So I told them what the book was about. And the guy, who is a goy from Connecticut, said, one of my dear friends growing up, his grandfather survived the Holocaust by living in the forest.
Stop. Are you
And there's an
serious?
article about him in the LA Times. I had this conversation with him last night. So anyway, my point, all of this to say, there are so many weird life things that happen in the Forest of Vanishing Stars that I think a lot of people would read and say, there's no way that anything like this would ever happen. But like the fact that I can point to so many things in my own life that have happened. I mean, Kristin, learning that you're Jewish at the point in your life when you did, the family history that you have while you in the middle of writing the book is when you learn that you were practically writing a family story. So anyway, tell us about some of these like fantastical, mystical, how did Yerusha come to be, and the engine of almost magic realism, fairy tale. And when I say fairy tale, I mean grim fairy tale.
No, you're right. I always say it feels like a dark fairy tale at the beginning.
Yeah.
Well, okay, so I'll answer that in a second, but first of all, I wanted to say thank you for sharing that, because that was such a cool thing to hear. And I love that. Like, I love that feeling that sometimes things in life, I look at them as little signposts that you're on the right path.
Yeah.
Like when these things that should have no explanation line up like that, it just feels like yeah, like this is exactly where I'm meant to be at this moment in time, and like that means I'm going the right way, you know what I mean? So that was a cool thing that you shared. And I have to share that it's interesting because when I was writing this book, there's a character in the book named Zeus, and that was not his initial name. His initial name in the first draft was Baruch. And in my head, he's still Baruch. I loved that name. It came from nowhere. He was just Baruch. Like from the second I thought of that character, his name was Baruch. And my editor didn't feel, if you've read the book, I guess read the spoiler part, my editor didn't feel like that name as a first name said like sexy, strong, like forest guy, to the like the average American reader. So she was like, it has to be like that name just didn't hit me the right way, like, which happens a lot with names. It wasn't, it wasn't anything specific to that name. We do that a lot. We change a lot of names because she's like, I'm not really feeling this name. But that was when I really kind of fought for. I was like, no, he's Baruch. Like, he has to be Baruch. She was like, he's not Baruch. I'm telling you, he's not Baruch. Like, so we had this whole thing about that. So the book was all turned in. We had changed his name, and I was approached by a producer who wanted to option the Book of Lost Names, and we had just basically already optioned it to another producer, so it didn't work out for him to option it. But since then, he has become a dear friend, and he and I are working on several other projects together. Like, it has been the beginning. That was the beginning of a beautiful personal relationship and a beautiful professional relationship. He's very just a dear, dear person to me now. And his name is Jonathan Baruch. So like, what are the odds? And so like, I told him this, like maybe like a couple months after knowing him. And I really think he probably doesn't believe me, that I was just like, like if I had just said to you now, like, oh, also there was a guy in the book named Blitman, I swear. But like, no, there really was a guy in the, so anyways, it just felt like, I felt like he was meant to come into my life. And
yes.
Anyways, sorry, that was a long story.
No, I love that.
And and he's just he's wonderful. But and I feel like I wrote him into wrote him in my book into existence.
Right, he could have your book, you did him in real life.
Exactly. So you asked about the magical realism. So yes, the book begins with kind of a dark fairy tale vibe, and it does feel like magical realism for the first couple of chapters, because we're in the viewpoint of Yerusha, who is this woman who kidnaps Yona because she feels that she's been called by the forest itself to do that. So she believes in all of this, magical realism in real life, right? Like, she believes that the forest speaks to her. She believes that there's this greater plan. She believes all of these things. And so I, even as the writer, don't have a 100% answer as to whether she really does see a bigger picture or whether she's just crazy and she's just justifying all of these things that she's doing. Because then you also have to go back to the, like, what came first, the chicken or the egg? Like, did Yona grow up to be who she grew up to be because she was always fated to be that? Or did she grow up to be that because she was taken away from her home and raised that way? And like, did Yona's father turn out the way he did because he was already on that path? Or did he turn out the way he did because this woman came in and stole his child and destroyed his life and kind of turned him to the dark side, right? Like, so that's a really interesting component of the identity question too. Like, how much do these things that happen along the path shape us? So I think if I had to say, I would say that there was something a little bit magic about Yerusha, because she does know things about the future that do end up coming true. But they could also just be super excellent guesses, or sometimes someone said, like, it's the reason that I think it's a little dangerous to go to a fortune teller, because if a fortune teller tells you, like XY, you're going to fall in love with a 6'2" man who has a mustache and blue eyes. Like, the way you interact with 6'2" men with mustaches and blue eyes from that point on might always be a little bit different. So like, do you know what I mean? Like, how much does those things that are supposedly foretold actually shape things? So,
but hearing your story of how the book came to be, and the answer was, I don't know. And then as you're in the middle of it, you're learning about your family history. I mean, that's essentially Yerusha. She doesn't know why she's being called to this moment. This is what she believes. And like, look at how it all played out. So to talk a little bit more about some of these, what I'll use as the word unbelievable things happening in the book. There are two things I'm very curious to know. Something, and I know some of our readers are too. They've these are some of the questions that they've asked about. So Dad coming back.
Okay. Is
there like a timeline, a justification, other than it being like a really useful plot device as a writer? And I don't mean to, like, I was on the journey, as I'm sure everyone else was, every step of the way, and was like, of course the dad is there. That makes total sense. But for you, were you able to kind of justify it in a way beyond suspending your disbelief that they wouldn't show up in the way that they did like that? Does that make sense?
Yeah. So first of all, like the military journey he would have been on, as far as like the way he rose up through the ranks, would have placed him. It would have been very conceivable that he did wind up in a
Mm,
place like that, which was one of the things I did at the beginning, tinkering with how old he was and where he came from. So sometimes when you're writing a book and you know that there's something that has to happen as a plot point, like you said, because it just had to, fit very nicely into the plot, you kind of have to go back and like reconfigure pieces of the past so that they add up correctly to the present. So there
mhm.
was some of that with the dad. There was some of going back to sort of remanipulate the things that had happened in his past. But him ending up in that part of Europe with that part of with that type of command, would have been likely. Now, yes, I agree that that was a gigantic coincidence that they would run into each other, um, unless you believe what Yerusha believed,
Sure.
which was that there was a greater plan for Yona all along, right?
Yeah.
And
Well, and it
so
happens that he could have realistically been there. So it is a mix of
absolutely could have
those things,
realistically been there.
right?
Yes, yep. Um, and I always think that in a book, like you can do one major thing that's like that that has the reader say like, really, like, could that happen? And like, yes, like the one major thing could happen, but I couldn't have had things like that in every single chapter. Do you know what I mean? Like it's yeah. But I do think that one made sense, and I just knew from the beginning that they had to their paths had to intersect again.
Right. So, and if we sleuthed properly, we could have pieced it
You
together.
could have followed it. Yes. I
Right.
need to write like an accompanying short story tracing the military journey
Oh, that's
of
fun.
Siegfried Eutner.
So
Right.
we're limited on time. I want to be very respectful of everyone's time. So I also, because that we are in the spoiler zone, I also have to say I struggled, and I know some other people struggled with the fact that there was, for lack of a better phrase, a happy ending. It was very tragic. Obviously, there was lots of death and lots of terrible things.
Yeah.
But I was kind of shocked that Yona survived. There were some other people who were like, wait, I thought she was dead. Was she shot? What happened? I realized, and I'm sure other people realized too, growing up, I only read stories where everyone dies at the end. It was like Hamlet of
Right.
World War II stories. And I was
Yeah.
like, oh, wait a minute, there are World War II stories that could have a
Yeah.
happier ending than
Yeah.
what we're typically used to. How did you feel about writing that?
Um, that's a great question. I have written other books where I have killed off the main characters in the end. And I'm not going to say the books, but it has happened. And it is a very, very, very painful thing to do. But
Hmm.
in this specific book I'm actually referring to, and again, I'm not going to say which one because I don't want to
And you've written enough
spoil it
that
for anyone.
there's,
Yeah, exactly. It was one of my world. I mean, people die in every one of my books because like it's World War II, of
it's
course.
life.
Like
Also,
it's life, exactly. But there was one particular book where two of the main characters did die at the end, and that was really hard for me. But they also had to, like, I just knew it from the journey of the story. Like there was no other realistic way to end that story. Like there was no way these two people survive, right? Um, this story, though, there was a way that she could survive because um, that's what it was about in those woods. Every single person who was out there was someone who shouldn't have survived. The odds against them were enormous. And I know if you've read the book and if you've stuck around now, you probably have read it because you're here for the spoilers. But if you've read the book and read the author's note, you know that I got a chance to talk to Aaron Bielski, who's the only Bielski brother from that initial group I mentioned who's still alive. He's 94. He was 14 when he fled into the woods for the first time. He spent all these years in the woods. Um, he shouldn't still be here. I mean, his story was that the police came for him, came for his parents. He hid in the barn. His parents were taken away. It was a Friday. His parents were dead by Monday. He just hid. He hid, and they didn't find him. And 80 years later, he's still here. And he has children, he has grandchildren, he has great grandchildren. I think he might even have great great grandchildren. But it's all of these generations of people that existed because the impossible happened. Um, and I think, to me, just from kind of a poetic storytelling standpoint, the impossible had to happen to the person we've been with through the whole
Hmm.
story, because she survived against all the odds, just like the real people did in the forest. And in reality, not everybody survived, but an astounding number did. And so I think that's reflected in the way the book ends, I
I
hope.
mean, so many people did. And frankly, like the fact that it feels like the forest was magical. It had to be, right? And I need
Yes.
to believe that it was in real life.
Yes. Yes, in real life, absolutely. How did 1,200 people from one group walk out of the forest alive after they had been like actually explicitly
Right.
hunted by the Germans in the forest? I
And
mean,
that's not fiction, that's real life.
that's real life. Like God was with them. I mean, that is it's incredible. It's incredible, and it's one of those things that just makes me believe that there's, I don't know, it just it blows me away. It makes me believe.
So to how did we get the title? Because I know there's a journey with the title.
So the initial
Not the
title,
forest.
yeah. So the initial title was actually the Dove of the Dark Forest, because Yona's name, means dove, and she has the dove birthmark on her wrist, and there's a lot of dove symbolism and peace and all that, and it obviously takes place in a dark forest, so that just felt like the right title to me. But my publisher said, no, that sounds like a young adult fantasy novel.
Mm.
And I was like, oh man, it totally does. Like I got what they were saying. But that had been my working title for so long that it was really hard for me to get my head somewhere else. And especially to get my head somewhere else when they were like, yeah, that title doesn't work and we need a new title in a week. So it was like, oh my gosh, what am I going to do? And so I basically brainstormed with two different groups. I brainstormed with the other authors from Friends in Fiction, who's that, that's the show you mentioned at the beginning. So those authors are Mary Kay Andrews, Patty Callahan Henry, Christy Woodson Harvey, and Mary Alice Monroe. So we were on a text string, and I was like, you guys help, like throw me anything you can, because some of them had already read the book and I just needed help. And
Mhm.
then the other email chain was my editor, my agent, and my two publicists. And together, everyone was just throwing out every suggestion, every word. And I don't actually know who came up with Forest of Vanishing Stars, or if it was a combination of two things that somebody, it was the second it was there, I was like, oh my gosh, yes, because that works on so many levels. Like
Mm.
the stars vanish when they're, the deeper they get into the forest, the safer they are. But the deeper they get, the thicker the tree canopy is, so the stars vanish overhead. Um, uh, there's also kind of a double meaning to it, because there's a line in the book where they're traipsing into the swamp and they talk about how they're losing the stars overhead. And one of the refugees taps the place where the star that he had to wear used to be, and he says, by the grace of God, may we all be vanishing stars.
Right.
And I loved that kind of dual symbolism, and I liked the idea that when these people moved into the forest, they got to take their stars off, the stars that they had been forced to wear, and that those became vanishing stars. There were just like a lot of levels on which that title worked, and
Mhm.
it just sounded so beautiful and so lyrical. And I was like, yes, that's like 1,000 times better than the Dove of the Dark Forest.
In the Google form, one of the questions
Yeah,
that I posed to people was, what does the title of Forest of Vanishing Stars mean to you? And a few things that people said was, our souls live on forever in the symbolism of the stars. We vanish from earth but cannot die, which I think is really beautiful.
yeah,
A symbol
that's
of hope
awesome.
that the stars appear to vanish but are always there. Um, thought that the title meant that the events within Europe were becoming worse, which is also really interesting. But
Yeah,
yeah, I think for me, it was always the stars on the person were
yeah,
vanishing as they were going into the forest. Um,
that's awesome.
one other quick
That was
thing,
cool to hear.
yeah, I mean, it was
Yeah,
really beautiful, some of these things that folks were saying. Um, Something that everyone might not be aware of is that the book was written entirely in 2020.
yeah,
And the more I think about it, the more I really get emotional, because it's a story about isolation. It's a
yeah,
story about trusting the people around you, and relearning to trust the people around you,
yeah,
and coming out of isolation and needing to
right,
go back into isolation. And I was like,
right.
what this is, Can you talk on that at all? Did you feel that?
Yeah,
Was that something that moved you or inspired you? Was it Beshert?
I think it was, and that's a great question because what's interesting is I pitched and sold this book before 2020, but before the pandemic started. And I think I sold it maybe in February of 2020. It was definitely before the beginning of the pandemic, though, so I already knew this is what I was writing about. But I think writing it while the pandemic was happening deepened it, and I think it deepened the way I wrote it. I think it made my journey through the novel as a writer more emotional and more difficult. Like it made the writing harder for me um, because I could identify with some of it in a way that I probably wouldn't have been able to as well if we weren't going through that at the same time. Um, but yeah, I mean, I think it just added extra layers to it, and um, it was a difficult book to write during the pandemic, but I think it was the book I needed to write
Hmm.
during the pandemic. And I think it's a better book for it because you're right. It is about isolation. And there was so much in this last year, though, that taught us. And I guess that not just the last year, it's what we're still going through, isn't it? But especially during those really uncertain first months where everything just felt terrifying and we had zero control over it. Before there were vaccines, before we understood the virus as well as we do now, it was scary and it felt. I don't know. I think reading stories like this and writing a story like this um, felt more more impactful and maybe more relatable than ever before, if that makes sense. Because while there's certainly really no comparison, um, realizing that you really have no control over sometimes these things that happen in your life, but that you do have control over the way you face them
Hmm.
and the way that you move forward into the world and help others if you can. To me, that was really a lesson that I learned and that I find in these types of books also.
I love that. I hope that we have all taken
I hope
something
so
from the
too.
Forest of Vanishing Stars
Oh, thank you. I hope
to
so too.
bring out into the world and make it a better place if we can, and
Thank
share it
you.
with all of your friends. So many of the questions tonight were, thank you so much to those of you who either submitted them via the chat or who
Thank
wrote
you.
them in the Google Doc. We cobbled them together as beautifully as we could. I hope you felt a little bit of community getting to see each other's faces. Kristin, this has been so terrific. We're thrilled to
Thank you
have
so
you.
much for having me.
We'll
This
just
meant
need
so
to do
much to me.
we'll need to do another book club for Book of Last Names
I am totally in,
because
Jason. I'm not kidding. I would love to do that if you want to.
terrific. So check more about Kristin. KristinHarmel.com. Kristin with an IN.
Yes.
It's in all of the emails that we sent you. So make sure you take a look there. Also, make sure to check out her incredible series, Friends in Fiction,
Thank you.
friendsandfiction.com. It is a group of 5 friends who all happen to be best-selling writers talking about books and about other books with other writers. It's a delight.
Thank
And I
you.
have to say, in the episode that is The Forest of Vanishing Stars, there is a special mini musical that the
Yes.
one and only Kristin Harmel wrote for The Forest of Vanishing Stars. You have to check it out. There were, just to also say, there were other questions that were asked that we weren't able to get to tonight, though I will say that a lot of them have been answered in other ways. Things like how Kristin gets some of her character names, things like that. Do a little YouTubing to find some other programs that Kristin has been a part of. I promise they're beautifully answered. I think that's everything. Are there other places people can find you, Kristin?
Uh, I mean, I guess, yeah, Facebook, like you said, Instagram, Twitter.
Great.
Yeah, oh, yeah. It's actually harder not to find me, I think, sometimes because I just feel like I'm doing virtual events all the time. So it's like, yeah, I'm probably too many places.
And I want to let you go, but quickly, what's next? Tell everyone what are we anticipating from you?
So the working title is The Paris Daughter. I don't know if that's the title that's going to stick or not, but
Okay.
it's
So
another World
inside
War.
scoop, everyone.
What's that?
Inside scoop, everyone. That's
Inside scoop, exactly. It's another World War II story that is set in Paris and also in 1960s New York. And it's a story about 2 mothers, 2 daughters, a an Allied bomb that accidentally falls somewhere it shouldn't, which was a real thing that happened in the suburbs of Paris. Um, some lives torn apart, and the way that reverberates through the next 15 or 20 years and impacts the life of two mothers and one daughter, if that makes sense. So I don't have my pitch down yet because I'm still in the middle of writing it, but those are kind of the elements. So
Well, we can't wait. I'm sure I speak for everyone when I say we're all stoked. There are 75 people that are still here and just waiting for every word. Kristin,
awesome.
thank you so much. Have a wonderful night.
Thank you. Thank you so much.
Everyone, thank you for joining us. Check out Kristin's work. If you haven't read it, buy The Forest of Vanishing Stars from your local bookstore. And have a wonderful night. Thanks, everyone.
Thank you, Jason. And thanks, everyone, for coming. Thank you.
Good night, Kristin.
Good
Bye,
night.
everyone.
Bye.